Back in 2012, a dealer told a customer her nearly new GM was fine burning a quart of oil every 1,000 miles. I called GM myself, and they told me a quart every 750 miles was their own normal. My name is Gary Holt, and I've spent over 40 years with my hands in engines, roofs, and houses, and I'd never heard anything like that in my life. Since then, I've found the same thing across the board. Ford, Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen. Every brand has picked its own number for how much oil loss is acceptable, and some of those numbers would have gotten an engine pulled apart 40 years ago. It comes down to three things stacked right on top of each other, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what they are and what you can do about it. That customer from 2012 was my buddy Pete. He'd just picked up a nearly new GM SUV, maintained it exactly the way the manual told him to, and within a year he was topping off oil almost every month. Pete called me the way he always does when something doesn't add up, and told me the dealer said a quart every 1,000 miles was nothing to worry about. So instead of taking the dealer's word for it, I called GM myself. Their own people told me a quart every 750 miles counted as normal consumption on that engine, and that stopped me cold. In over 40 years working on engines, roofs, and houses, I had never once heard a manufacturer admit a number like that out loud. Here's what that number means for an owner. You maintain the vehicle exactly the way the manual tells you to, and you still end up staring down an engine job that runs anywhere from $6,000 to more than $20,000, because the manufacturer decided ahead of time how much oil your engine is allowed to burn. Most people in that spot don't rebuild anything. They just get rid of a car that's fine in every other way and go buy a different one. That's the part that gets me most. The engine block is fine, the transmission is fine, and so is the body. Every single time I've seen this happen, one system inside that engine changed, and figuring out what it is and why is the whole reason we're having this conversation. Once I started asking around, GM wasn't even the worst of it. Right now, GM's own standard is actually loosened up to about a quart every 2,000 miles across most of their lineup, which sounds better than 750 until you remember that number used to be 0. Ford currently considers a quart every 3,000 miles normal, which isn't great, but it isn't the worst on this list either. Hyundai and Kia both land at a quart every 1,000 miles. Honda, which surprised me the first time I looked it up, is also sitting at a quart every 1,000 miles. Toyota runs about a quart every 1,100 to 2,100 miles. And Volkswagen, Audi, and BMW all land at roughly a quart every 1,000 miles as well. None of those numbers came from a government agency, because there isn't one that regulates oil consumption. There's no federal standard that says how much oil an engine of a given size is allowed to burn between changes, so every manufacturer gets to write its own definition of normal and defend it however it wants. Consumer Reports ran a survey covering close to 1 million vehicles over 10 years and found some owners were topping off oil as often as once a month, even on vehicles still covered by warranty. That survey also turned up something worth remembering before we go any further. Some of these brands' worst offenders were dozens of times more likely to get oil complaints than an average vehicle in the same study. That's not a rounding error. So when a dealer tells you a number is normal, understand that the number is coming from the manufacturer's own playbook, not from any outside authority checking their work. Subaru's a special case worth mentioning, because their boxer engines lay the cylinders flat instead of standing them up like most engines do. Oil sits differently around a flat-mounted piston than it does in an upright one, so a boxer engine burning more oil than an inline engine isn't automatically a sign something's broken. It's partly just the layout. Subaru's own standard runs around a quart every 1,000 to 2,200 miles because of that. And their oil consumption problems got serious enough a few years back that a class action lawsuit forced them into extending warranty coverage on it out to 8 years or 100,000 miles. Some manufacturers have rolled out fixes without ever calling them a recall. Audi issued a technical bulletin on one of their engines that had owners complaining about oil use, and the fix involved a revised valve to reduce pressure inside the crankcase, along with a software update, followed by a formal oil consumption test to confirm it worked. That tells you the engineers already know exactly where the problem lives. It just never gets called a defect, because nothing about oil consumption trips the kind of safety threshold that forces a manufacturer's hand the way a brake or airbag problem would. That raises the obvious question of whether any of this is actually new, or if engines have always burned oil like this, and nobody talked about it. Go back to the 1960s and 1970s, and none of this was happening. Those were 3,000-mile oil change vehicles, and if you lost even half a quart in 3,000 miles, people noticed and got concerned about it. I wasn't turning wrenches yet in the 1970s. I started in the early 1980s, but I worked on plenty of vehicles built in that era, and oil consumption just wasn't a thing you dealt with. Not with the big three, and not with the handful of Hondas that were already on the road. A lot changed under the hood between the 1970s and the 1990s that had nothing to do with oil rings. That was the stretch where smog controls, catalytic converters, and computer-controlled fuel systems all got bolted on, mostly to clean up the exhaust coming out of cities that badly needed it. I'm all for that part. Cleaner air out of a tailpipe is a good trade, and by the time the mid-1990s rolled around, those systems had matured into solid, reliable engines. Fast forward to the mid-1990s, and the pattern still held. Fuel economy back in 1978 averaged across every new vehicle sold that year, sat around 13.1 miles per gallon, which is rough by any measure. By 1995, that average had climbed to roughly 24.8 miles per gallon, a real jump, and engines from that era still weren't burning oil the way they do now. The EPA's own long-term tracking backs up both ends of that story, showing the industry moved from about 13.1 miles per gallon in the mid-1970s up to right around 27.2 miles per gallon in the most recent data available. Sit with that gap for a second. From 1995 to today is 30 years, and in that entire stretch, fleet-wide fuel economy only moved a couple miles per gallon. We picked up maybe 2.5 miles per gallon over 3 decades, and in exchange, we created an oil consumption problem that didn't used to exist at all. The EPA's own reporting shows that most of whatever gain shows up in that final number comes from electric and hybrid vehicles getting folded into the average, not from gains inside a regular gasoline engine. So what changed inside these engines to cause this? It comes down to one part more than any other, a piece of metal about the size of a rubber band, sitting right behind the piston. That piece of metal is the piston ring, and there are a few of them wrapped around every piston in your engine. Their whole job is to seal combustion pressure against the cylinder wall and scrape the extra oil back down where it belongs, so you get power up top and clean oil control down below. Back when rings had higher tension, they gripped the cylinder wall hard to do that job, and that grip came with a real cost, more drag on every stroke, and more fuel burned fighting that friction. So when manufacturers went looking for ways to squeeze out fuel economy, the ring pack was one of the first places they turned. Engineers moved to thinner, lower tension rings that ride the cylinder wall with a lot less force, the same way a loose rubber band sits against a jar lid instead of a tight one gripping down hard. Less drag on the rings does mean better mileage, and on paper that trade works fine. Here's where it falls apart in the real world. A low-tension ring depends on staying clean and free to move in its groove, because it doesn't have the muscle to push through anything gumming it up. Modern engines run hotter combustion pressures than the ones these rings were originally built around, and any carbon or varnish that builds up in that ring groove is enough to make the ring stick instead of flexing the way it's supposed to. Once a ring sticks, it stops sealing and stops scraping oil the way it was designed to, and that's when consumption starts climbing even though nothing on the engine broke in the traditional sense. Direct injection makes this worse, and almost every new gasoline engine on the road runs it now. Spraying fuel straight into the cylinder instead of mixing it in the intake gives you sharper combustion and better mileage, but it also means higher pressure right where that low-tension ring is trying to hold its seal. Some of that pressure sneaks past the ring pack as blow-by, carrying oil vapor with it into the crankcase, and that vapor is exactly what starts turning into the varnish and carbon that jammed the ring up in the first place. That's the piece people miss. This isn't a part wearing out from age or mileage. It's a ring doing exactly what a low-tension design will do the moment deposits get in its way. And deposits are exactly what the next two problems are built to create. The second piece is how long we go between oil changes now. We used to run 3,000-mile intervals across the board, and now it's routine to see 5,000, 7,500, 10,000. And I've personally seen manufacturers push all the way out to 25,000 miles between services. Stretch that interval out on an engine with low-tension rings, and you're giving carbon far more time to build up in those ring grooves before anything ever gets cleaned out. The third piece is turbocharging, and this is the one most owners never connect to oil consumption at all. Smaller turbocharged engines run hotter than naturally aspirated ones, and that heat runs straight through the same oil that's supposed to be protecting your rings. You've probably seen a turbocharged performance car sit there running on its own for several minutes after the driver's already walked away. And that's not a glitch. That's the manufacturer deliberately circulating oil to cool the turbo down before shutting off completely. Now think about what a normal driver does. They come off the highway doing 70 miles an hour, drive a couple miles to the house, and shut the engine off right away. All that heat trapped in the turbo housing just cooks the oil, sitting there baking it into carbon. And that carbon eventually works its way right back to the piston rings we already talked about. All of that oil vapor and blow-by has to go somewhere, and that's the job of a small system called the PCV, which routes crankcase pressure back into the intake so it gets burned off instead of building up. Load the engine harder, spin it faster, or run it hotter with a turbo, and more oil vapor gets pushed through that same system. A PCV system that's doing exactly what it was designed to do will still carry more oil through it on a hot, hard-driven turbo engine than it ever would on a naturally aspirated one just cruising along. Put all three pieces together, and you've got a low-tension ring that can't fight off deposits, an oil change interval that gives those deposits time to build, and a turbo baking the oil into carbon before it ever gets flushed out. You'll also notice a lot less blue smoke than you'd expect from all that consumption, and that's because modern catalytic converters burn off a good share of the oil-derived exhaust before it ever leaves the tailpipe. No smoke doesn't mean no problem, it just means the evidence is getting cleaned up on the way out. My wife Carol just went through this with me firsthand. We needed a bigger vehicle for a family trip to Tennessee. Grandkids gear and all, and the old Hummer we'd been driving had worn out its welcome a long time before that. So we went out and bought her a new Lexus, a 4-cylinder with a turbo. Not exactly my first choice, but it was her birthday and it's what she wanted. That little Turbo 4 struggled climbing real mountain grades, and if I lived somewhere steeper than around here, I probably wouldn't have picked it. It's not a mountain truck. But for the driving Carol actually does. It's been a fine vehicle, and buying new this time made more financial sense than buying used once I compared the interest rates. Here's what I decided to do with it, knowing everything you just heard about rings, intervals, and turbo heat. We're running oil changes on that Lexus every 3,000 miles, not the 5,000 the manufacturer recommends, because I want carbon cleaned out of that engine long before it ever gets a chance to build up around the rings. Call it a running experiment if you want, but I'd rather spend a little more on oil now than gamble on a new engine down the road. This is the question that's bothered me the most through all of this. If shortening the oil change interval actually helps protect these rings, why doesn't the manufacturer just tell owners to do it? I'll give you my take on this, and I want to be upfront that it's an opinion, not something I can put a document in front of you and prove. Every time a manufacturer tells owners to change a fluid more often, whether it's engine oil or transmission fluid, that recommendation works against them on the fuel economy and emissions numbers they get measured on. Follow the incentive. It's the same underlying logic that got us lifetime transmission fluid, a term plenty of mechanics have rolled their eyes at for years. Because fluids that never get serviced don't need a maintenance schedule that might raise questions about long-term durability. I'm not trying to sound like I've found some hidden conspiracy here. I'm just telling you what the incentives look like from where I sit, and you're welcome to disagree with me on it. What's actually true, and not up for debate, is that the oil itself has gotten better, and so have the filters. Both of those things are real improvements. The problem is, we've built engines that eat through that better oil faster than ever, so all that improvement in the product gets canceled out by a design that consumes more of it. Go back to that Audi bulletin I mentioned earlier for a second, because it proves my point either way. The fix wasn't a new set of piston rings or a redesigned engine. It was a valve change and a software update aimed at crankcase pressure, the smallest correction that would move the needle on a formal consumption test. That's not me accusing anybody of hiding something illegal. It's just what it looks like when the cheapest fix that satisfies the test gets chosen over the fix that actually solves the problem for the owner driving the thing for the next 15 years. Start with the simplest fix there is. Shorten your own oil change interval below whatever the manufacturer recommends, especially if you're driving anything with a turbo or direct injection. And don't wait for a dealer to tell you it's necessary. If you've got a turbocharged vehicle, give it a couple minutes of idle time after hard highway driving before you shut it off, the same way those performance cars do it automatically, Let it breathe. That short wait lets the oil circulate and cool down, instead of baking inside a hot turbo housing the second you kill the engine. If you already suspect carbon is built up around your rings, there are products built specifically to deal with it. Automotive Test Solutions makes a carbon removal additive that gets poured in and run through the engine before a service, and I've had good luck with it. Valvoline also put real money into their Restore product, which is an oil company admitting the same problem exists and trying to solve it chemically instead of just selling you more oil to replace what you're burning. And don't skip the dipstick just because your dash isn't warning you about anything. Pull it once a month, not once a year, especially through the first couple years you own anything turbocharged or direct injected. A catalytic converter can burn off the smoke that used to warn people their engine was in trouble, so the dipstick is doing a job your eyes and nose used to do for free. Let me put a number on all of this so it sticks. Say you've got a 5-quart engine on a 7,500-mile service interval, and you're burning a quart of oil every 1,000 miles, which is right in line with several of the brands we already covered. By the time that engine hits its next scheduled service, you've added about 7 quarts of fresh oil on top of the 5 it started with. Think about what that means. You've put more oil into that engine between changes than it even holds, so by the time the shop drains it and puts in a new filter, most of what's coming out was already fresh. You're not really changing old oil for new anymore. You're just topping off a system that's replacing itself through consumption and paying for a full service on top of it. Rings, intervals, and turbo heat stacked on top of each other. That's the whole story, and the interval is the one piece you actually control. Check your dipstick more often than you think you need to, and know your engine's real consumption rate before a dealer hands you a number and calls it normal. Next time, I'll show you how to catch oil consumption early, before it turns into an engine you're paying to replace.